Hi there. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm just going to give it a minute or so to allow people to join and then we'll get started with today's content. Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Cyber Hut in conjunction with Silverfort. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and research analyst at the Cyber Hut. And it's absolutely thrilled to be talking today about closing the AD, the Active Directory Privileged Access gap. I think it's unfortunately a gap which has grown and grown to a considerable size over the last few years. So it's absolutely timely and fascinating topic to be digging into today. And I guess before we sort of dive into today's content, a couple of little housekeeping items before we get started. Obviously, we are on Zoom today, so everybody is centrally muted, but we do have the Q&A functionality live, so you should be able to find that on the right-hand side of the panel there, and you can drop in your questions and comments as we go along. We'll try and answer those in situ, in flight as we go, but we will leave a bit of time at the end to wrap up any questions which we haven't yet answered. And of course, we are recording today, so you will receive access to the on-demand version of this afterwards to watch again or perhaps share with colleagues and the like afterwards. So closing the AD privilege access. I started my career back early 2000s, 2001 on Active Directory. Back in the day, I was actually a Novell directory engineer for what it's worth back 25 years ago, which seems a different world, I guess. Then obviously Active Directory, it's been around 25, 26 years, introduced with Windows 2000, and clearly it is the bedrock for many organizations in their sort of corporate identity world. But unfortunately, it is becoming a target for multiple different adversarial aims. And we're hopefully going to uncover some of that today, and more importantly, solutions to try and overcome and protect and detect and try and overcome some of those issues. But I guess a couple of introductions before I start. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and research analyst at the Cyber Hut. And the Cyber Hut is a global industry analyst and advisory firm. We track a whole host of different vendors across the identity security space. And identity security has become such a critical enabler over the last 5 or 6 years to protect organizations, but also help generate revenue, help with collaboration and sharing and other. And it's been really fascinating to look at areas like PAM and how they have just evolved continually, certainly, I guess, over the past decade or so. And I'm joined by Rob Ainscough, Chief Identity Security Advisor from Silverfort. Rob, thanks for taking some time out to chat with me today.
Good to be here. Good to be here. Good to join you. Yeah, a really important subject. I've spent quite a few years in identity now. I ran a really big identity program for about 10 years, looking at all those kind of classic pillars of IAM that you might expect, IGA, SO, MFA, but PAM as well. And PAM was, one of the most difficult things that I had to face into as a practitioner. About a year ago, I joined the team here at Silverfort, as you say, Chief Identity Security Advisor. So really working with companies to to understand what this looks like, what success looks like, and how we can break down some of those long-standing challenges that we've seen. And privileged access is one of those, and AD's definitely not going anywhere. So it's one of the most important for a lot of companies.
Yeah, for sure. It's like almost a perfect storm, because you're right in the sense of Active Directory. It's been around for such a long time, and I think that brings with it, I guess, a couple of problems. One, the proliferation of it. Irregardless, you could be a 50 employee sort of mom and pop shop, home, tiny organization, right through to the biggest retail banks, huge hundreds of thousands of employees. So you have that huge sort of spectrum of proliferation. But then I think this counterpoint is that, AD, it's been around forever. It's fine. We install it really rapidly and then leave it and don't do the ongoing maintenance, management, and apply the controls to it, which perhaps they don't necessarily get applied. I think in addition to that, because it is such a central fulcrum to how organizations work, it becomes that target, doesn't it? It becomes a target for insider threat, external adversaries. It's sort of in the middle, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points that are really important here. It's and we'll talk about this a little more in a while, but it's really kind of the center of enterprise identity for a lot of companies. I speak to companies, and actually we see, maybe 5 years ago we thought the cloud would be it and everyone would transition to the cloud and happy days, no more Active Directory. But the reality is, with kind of data sovereignty concerns, cost concerns, I'm actually talking to companies who are going the other way, right? And they're saying, where's best for this workload to sit? And often that could be, Active Directory for those reasons. And you'd think, Active Directory has been around, as you say, 25, 26 years, but really protecting it is far from a solved problem. And that was something I found as a practitioner. You're worried about this systemic risk, so many things plugged into it. You're worried about lateral movement, you're worried about ransomware, but it's not an easy thing to change that story and get yourself to where you want to be in terms of protecting that core. And that's where, what we'll talk about today in terms of Vaultless PAM, super exciting and really important, I think, from those two perspectives.
Yeah, I think absolutely spot on. And of course, the evolution is happening both on the business side, but obviously also on the tech side as well. And it's trying to keep abreast with making sure Active Directory is delivering value and doing what it should be doing, but then obviously making sure it is delivering on the security side, the productivity side, emerging threats, and all the rest of that. I think it's a difficult place for it to be, I think, currently. And I guess today's agenda really, set the scene around where we are currently, ultimately around this issue around this unprivileged, unmanaged, I should say, privileged access. And I think, PAM is something which has been around for a long time commercially, and custom tools and the like. But it has to evolve, and it is evolving. To be honest, it is looking to deliver more use cases, more identities, hybrid deployments. And it has to continue on that journey, a little bit like governance administration as well. But then expand our sort of opinion here around, look, how can we have a much more unified approach to privileged access, looking at on-prem, looking at hybrid, looking at how we can take Active Directory, which isn't necessarily seen as a sort of privileged platform, but clearly has a whole host of privileged and high-risk issues within there. Then obviously then strategically looking at, you mentioned there, vaultless approaches to PAM, what that entails, what does that look like, how can sort of organizations get there. But I want to start off really set the scene a little bit around this unmanaged part, which is, I think historically, privileged access, it started off on premises, like most technology components did sort of 20 plus years ago. Very much sort of small scale deployments, a handful of some of the key administrators within organizations, perhaps they've got root Unix administrators, or the guys who looked after the SQL databases, and sort of quite big cost-grained approaches there. Clearly it was on-prem. And it was this vault-centric thing, wasn't it? So, for those, I guess, the audience watching black and white, the whole concept of a vault, in the sense of you'd have this secure, centralized location, which would probably contain credentials, passwords, shared secrets, maybe things like certificates and stuff. And it was like, let's put everything in this big, secure safe, and then only, give access to core administrators and I guess people looking after the infrastructure. But the world has changed, hasn't it? There are more things that needs to happen. It isn't just one or two servers anymore. It's everywhere, I guess.
It's radically different. I think there's a few things here. Threat landscape wise, if you compare, so Vault's kind of 2001 Enron SOX compliance, that's kind of where they were born, right? That approach was born, as you say, a much simpler, happier world, I think. In terms of, it was much simpler. AD was maybe the main component of enterprise identity. It was behind the firewall. We were really worried about those super privileged accounts, as you say, kind of domain admins, infrastructure admins, those kind of things. But the threat landscape changed radically over the last 25 years. When I was practitioner 10 years, it changed radically in that time as attackers pivoted to identity. And I think it's really interesting because when I talk about this, really 25 years ago, maybe Active Directory was enterprise identity. It was like a two-dimensional problem to protect that thing. But almost all of the business innovation since then has been driven through identity and changes in that architecture. So you've got kind of VPNs coming on stream for supporting outsourcers, remote work, again, probably using Active Directory credentials, cloud and SaaS enabled through IDPs, probably using Active
Yeah,
Directory
yeah,
credentials. So it really became this three-dimensional problem, this kind of system of systems of identity where risk is really moving beyond between those components. So you've got third-party risk coming into Active Directory, you've got cloud risk coming into Active Directory, and they're really risks it wasn't exposed to in the past. And that's really what attackers have exploited. So, identity has become the main thing because of the way we've architected and the way identity's changed. But how do we protect that core? Because it's no longer just about a subset of administrator accounts. It's also about your tier one application administrators, right? Your engineering teams developing the
yeah.
systems that run your business. And also all of those non-human accounts. They're not new. Service accounts have been around forever, but the proliferation of those as we've connected systems means it's a much more complex environment to protect, but remains at that core, right? It's the center of things for us. But our approach to protection, as I say, not really changed in that time. Predominantly, we are focused on vault and rotate, and that's a difficult thing to scale for companies because feasibility is a big part of this. It's not just the controls it gives you, but it's can I put that down? Can I make that happen in my organization to gain that scale and protection that I want to gain? That's really important.
Well, why do you think I agree, by the way, with everything you've said. I think it's just, I guess, just to pull out, I was jotting down there that system of systems thing. I think that's
Yeah.
a really good term. And I talk about information flows quite a lot. And it's
Mm.
like, oh, what do you mean by a flow? And like, well, the bad guys don't care whether your access or your accounts or identities are located in that business unit, in that system or that direct, that they want to get from here to here, and they'll take any route available
Right.
to them, which is that flow of information, I guess. And the part I guess I want to amplify is what is that, I guess, limitation around vaulting and having that sort of system centric approach? Is it a lack of technology, different technology, or is it like an operational budget angle? Because I guess to us as sort of identity experts, we look at it and go, well, you've suddenly got identities everywhere, hybrid, SaaS, dev, everything else. So it's
Right.
quite logical to apply controls everywhere. But is it just like a legacy technology deployment angle that it's hard to migrate away from? What's your view there, do you think?
Well, I think having run quite a big PAM program and a vaulting deployment, I think there's a real strong link in practitioners' understanding of what PAM is between PAM and vaults.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
vaults are good for some things, but they are difficult to scale. They're difficult to implement. Frequently I'd have conversations about what does this account do and can I vault it? And people would come back and go, I don't know what it does and definitely not. And that would present you with organizational challenges because it's an active process to onboard to a vault, to bring credentials under control and gain that security that you're looking for. And it's really important that we're matching the technology with the organization because as you say, this is an everywhere problem. It's humans, it's non-humans, it's every system and every administrator account, not just a subset. So that ability to generate those outcomes that you want to control risk, because PAM's really about controlling risk. It's not about vaults, it's about controlling risk, and it needs different technologies with different dynamics to do that successfully. And that's what we're seeing change as we talk about this more and more. in the market is, there's an understanding that it needs different components to be successful and get that scale that you want in terms of protection. So it's something that's really about where the rubber hits the road of the technology. We really need to think about the dynamics of the technology and how it gets implemented, how it can get done, how we can scale it within our organizations. That's really, really important, because I think it's not about changing the world for identity. We don't want to change how people work. We don't want to change how our systems work. Identity is super sticky, right? You don't want to break anything when
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
implementing controls. So how do we harden what we've got? How do we take that kind of legacy or things we're not that proud of and bring them up to code? And I think that's the real challenge that we're facing into. How can I be secure without changing the world to do it? And I think that's really key in
yeah.
PAM and in risk control in general.
Right, that's a really important point, isn't it? I think it is hard to suddenly, I don't know, as you said, maybe put something in a vault or make a change or control something if you don't know what that thing or that credential or that account is actually doing. And it
Right.
does it becomes an almost you become too risk averse. It's like I can't change it. Or I risk getting it wrong, and that has a bigger impact.
And I always used to say the first rule of PAM Club is don't break anything.
Well,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
it's so true, right? And that holds a lot of organizations back, particularly as I talk to organizations who are more operationally focused. They want to get the job
Mm,
done. They also want to be secure whilst they do it, but it means they're not maybe ready to make wholesale changes. They don't have regulations behind them that say they have to do these things. So it's always a business decision at the end of the day, what we want to do and how that's going to work for our business. And I think it's really important to know that not all businesses look the same. A bank is not the same as a
yeah.
retailer or a manufacturer. And it's about meeting the right technology with the culture of your company to get yourself to a point where you're acceptably secure given your operational bias effectively.
Mm. You've got to meet the business where they are, isn't it? It's that
Right.
it's that cliched thing. You can't ask them to. I think some of the big issues with sort of IGA, which is obviously a cousin of the stuff we're talking about here, is you have to sort of force the organisation to adopt a particular
Mhm.
process or a particular
Mm.
type of sort of technological feature, and that is the inhibitor to adoption. It's the inhibitor to it being used
Yeah.
effectively. I think as we sort of see PAM proliferate away from a small subset of Unix systems or whatever to this privileged risk being everywhere, you have to meet the business where they are and on board seamlessly and provide flexibility. I think.
100%, because tool ownership doesn't equal security. It's the ability to put that down and implement it at a scale that equals security and the outcomes that you're looking for. And this is really what we talk about when we talk about vaultless PAM. We talk about generating the right outcomes of risk
Yeah,
control, and how can we do that feasibly at the scale today's threats demand. Because there's a lot of companies where there's a gap between where they are in terms of their protection and where they want to be. We're all about how we close that gap and how we do that in a way that works for your business.
yeah, yeah. I think that is it's really really important. I guess if we sort of introduce AD into this sort of conversation, if we are talking about more systems, more levels of risk, AD is really it is this fulcrum, isn't it? If you look at the sort of spoke and wheel sort of analogy, if you like, AD is sort of this thing in the middle, and we've got, I guess, a VPN on the left, but that could be anything really. It could be radius, it could be terminal services, it could be RDP, it could be anything
Yeah.
inbound, even a federated aspect there as well. And you mentioned IDPs at the top, and then I guess on the right you've got this increasing and continually growing set of relying systems, be they could be small on-premises things, federation in there, of course, SaaS, and just clearly ongoing
And
angle
it's
there.
removing risk, right? As you said it's information flows, but it's also risk flows between these. And one of the things I say, this is a system of systems. And as you rightly said, attackers see it as a single thing, right? They see it as one thing, identity, and they're willing to take whatever route needs to be taken to achieve their goal. Now, in most cases, and Scat Spider are a great example, they will dart towards Active Directory because they
Mm-hmm.
know it's underprotected historically by most companies. But it's all about exploiting that risk and that defense, that surface, that attack surface they've got. And I think as defenders, we've got to take that same mindset. How do we treat
Mm-hmm.
this as an integrated whole, where we treat it as a single defensive surface that has integrity and effectiveness, so that we take things like AD that aren't particularly good at identity security and we level them
Yeah.
up, but we also make it work as a team across the piece. because I think that's our philosophy at Silverfort. That's how we think we win at identity security. It's about making this thing work as an effective, coherent whole and not treating it as different parts of the puzzle that we have to put together and make sure kind of they might work together, but they might not. There might be a gap.
Yeah, I think that's everything's got to be it's so interoperable. I think these days to make identity successful in general. But I guess I just want to sort of pick on AD a little bit and sort of touch to this at the top of the call. Really. It's old. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of technology out there which is old. Look, TCP IP is old, right? We're not picking on it particularly for its age, but
No.
I think if we used to sort of zoom back a little bit to 2000 or the early 2000s, the sort of JML, the join and move and lever process, it wasn't built for security in mind. It was built as almost an extension of HR and that productivity angle to go from HR into a corporate directory and maybe into a downstream system around making sure the right staff had the right access at the right time, accelerating onboarding, bit of basic provisioning. It wasn't there for security. And I guess as well, if we sort of zoom back 25 years ago, so before zero trust, we had the internet obviously as this scary public place, and we sort of knew the internet was this big bad thing. But then we said, oh well, it's okay. We've got firewalls and we've got switches and we've got layer 3 controls and stuff here. So we're safe. The internal Active Directory is controlled. It's safe. The internet's bad. Clearly, that isn't the case anymore. Everything's a little bit more dynamic, porous, zero trust, and it's just again it amplifies the fact that yes, Active Directory, whatever you want to do single sign-on in Salesforce or Slack or something on-prem, but it also becomes almost like a bit of a dumping ground for every identity and account under the sun.
Yeah.
But all of those accounts are all different. We're not just talking standard users, are we? We're talking about DNS and DHCP operators, print stuff, service accounts. There's a whole plethora of account types, and they get dumped. And then suddenly it's like, wow, actually, that AD stuff, it isn't protected in a controlled environment. It's essentially a porous identity sort of repository there. Again, it's back to that perfect storm of massive dumping ground, lack of governance, public access. That doesn't bode well, I don't think.
Agreed, and I think that's the history and reality of it. As I say, attackers really do center on Active Directory. I think I was reading a study from Mandiant, and they said something like 90% of their IR cases are to do with Active Directory, and it is that perfect storm of things coming together because it's more exposed than it's ever been to outside risks. It's not about in the firewall, outside the firewall anymore, as we know. But for a lot of companies, they don't have a great handle on the privileges given out by AD. They don't always have a great handle on the life cycle. They might have too many accounts sitting out there, all of which means the attack surface is significant. And there's significant privileged things that sit in Active Directory, as you mentioned, things like DNS, your domain admins, your backup operators as well sitting in there. So there's a lot of risk centralized in one place that makes it a very attractive target. And that means for me, from my perspective and having seen this as a practitioner, I really think of it as one of the key things we have to work really hard to get a handle of and protect really well so that we don't have to worry about how exposed it is, because often we get combinations of things going on as well. It's not just about AD, but often we'll see flat networks internally, right? And from an ability to stop attacker movement perspective, we're not getting much from the network. So then it's really about AD. It's really about identity as the perimeter in that case. And how do we make that come to life? And how do we meet our protection goals in that context? Is a really critical problem.
Yeah, I think that combination thing is worth amplifying as well. I think it's
Yeah.
often, again, back in the old days, it was like, right, okay, you've got standard users and you've got like an administrator, whatever, a domain administrator or a downstream sort of root account, whatever it can be. And obviously that's fine. That's sensible. There's a lot more nuance to this as well. And it's often sort of no admin accounts, service accounts, which may perhaps do one particular function, maybe, handle your DNS configuration, and that's perfectly fine. But that is part of a much broader attack lifecycle. So part of that attack lifecycle, the attackers may well need to create DNS records, alter command and control routes, and they'll use a DNS operative account to do so. But then once that's finished, they may then look at DHCP or print or a database service account, whatever it can be, and they're going to use each of these individual components as part of that combined broader attack lifecycle. And I think that's something which often gets overlooked. It's, oh, well, what can you do with a DNS account, or what can you do with a, just accessing a read-only within a database? Well, actually, that could be used for enumeration. You can then pull out a whole host of usernames, and then you've got other parts
Exactly.
to deal with.
It really starts off a chain of events that
Yeah.
you're in a very low control position if we get into that point. And this is where that unmanaged privilege access, that gap that we talked about, is so important. Because, any time that we're relying on credentials only to secure a statically permissioned account that's going to sit there for a long time without a password rotation, probably, we're in a really high risk position, especially if we then got a flat network that we're able to traverse in terms of lateral movement, in terms of really big things happening in our environment. So that combination of things and layer of things that bring it together, that says, hey, we need to be really broad in considering how we protect this, and we need to be really robust in how we do that. Because, as we say, it is still at the center for a lot of companies. It has a lot of systemic risk associated with it, as you've said. And it's really incumbent on us to not just think about that narrow traditional, infrastructure admins, domain admins, but really that whole world of privilege that could start off that chain of events that we really don't want to happen, and are much harder to stop once they've started happening than being proactive and trying to stop them at source.
100%. Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's often retrospective, isn't it? You're cleaning up after the event has taken place, and I guess that sort of brings us a little bit to sort of, okay, we've created a bit of a problem here around what this looks like and the breadth and depth of AD's impact here. I think it is important to sort of say, well, actually, we need to think about end to end. We need to think about understanding non-admin accounts, service accounts, maybe NHI and other stuff going forward. And why isn't this PAM, old legacy PAM stuff, dealing with this? And I think there's, covered a little bit of this already about being, very focused. It was very sort of system centric, and it was often, looking at top high risk accounts, top high risk systems. It was static, very difficult to extend. And I guess back to that end to end view, it wasn't really thinking about risk. It was thinking about, right, okay, there's a single system. Give me the admins or the sort of known high risk accounts, and then that's it. We're done. And it was very linear in how it was managed. But is it fair to sort of kick that old PAM world, or is it just, I guess, a product of its time, and it did well 15 years ago, but it isn't capable enough for today?
I think the reality is, and none of this is to say that, vaulting is bad or wrong, but it's really that we've tried to stretch it to things it was never designed for, to a scale it was never designed for the complexity of human and non-human accounts, increasingly non-human, as we know. And we've really tried to kind of take the ball and run with it and stretch it from these kind of compliance-based limited use case into much, much, much broader security use cases as attacker threats have changed, right, over the last 10 years. And it's kind of unfair to do that, to expect that a technology that wasn't designed for a particular thing can suddenly scale from tens of accounts to thousands of accounts, from human to non-human, and expect that we generate the outcomes that we're looking for. It's just that we haven't really had necessarily an alternative to doing that in the past. And that's where the problem comes, because it's not about, as I say, it's not bad, it's not wrong, but it's certainly very, very difficult as we've tried to stretch it. And that's really what I think about from a practitioner perspective, is how do we generate those outcomes at scale?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it is. It is a changing landscape, and I think often you do find the technical failures get amplified if you are trying to use something out of character or just against a different set of use cases around. It could be NHI, it could be hybrid, volume, scale, or back to what we said earlier around just that flexibility of integration. Not all systems are the same. Not all systems have the same level of risk, have the same integration requirements and usage, and you have to have options. You have to have different approaches to this stuff, which I think maybe that I guess PAM, or the system-centric PAM, and it wasn't built for that. And we sort of look at, well, what do we need? How can we evolve this further? And I think there's some interesting parts on here is I want to sort of pick out. One is thinking about risk in general, and not just saying, right, okay, we've got one or two systems. integrated those in quite an isolated way. But we do have to think of that sort of end-to-end system of systems, end-to-end flow. But where does the risk exist in my business? What does my business really achieve and do? How is privileged or high privileged systems, how are they working? Where do they exist? How can we manage them? And I think it's just elevating the conversation a little bit more, isn't it?
I agree, and some of those critical systems can pop up in the most unexpected places. So I was talking to a company, and they said, we did an upgrade on a crane in a warehouse, the system that ran the crane, and
Yeah,
we screwed it up. It didn't go well. Couldn't bring it back. Couldn't get that thing back, and we could not ship any cheese for years after that. And they pop up in the most unexpected places. Like operational
yeah,
criticality is a broad church, right? In big companies, it's not just about your finance systems or payment and PII, but
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
much broader church, and it's how we think about that operational risk. Is we're more tech enabled as businesses than we've ever been before, and that
yeah.
criticality can pop up in the most unexpected places, which is driving that kind of breadth of protection that we're looking to gain, and how we understand what's really important to the business and prioritize it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm laughing. It's funny because that proliferation, it's really unknown, isn't it? And I think it
Yeah.
boils back down to, what does the business do? Makes and ships cheese, whatever. So how, where is technology helping and hindering that deliverable? And I think we often get a little bit caught up in the sort of the technicalities of things, servers and tin and bits and bytes and everything else. But
Totally.
it always has to relate to what is the business or a
Business
particular
risk.
team or function, what they're trying to achieve. And what if, you can, as you say, you can impact the sort of supply chain or the processing of something in very subtle ways. I think this again boils back down to this: what's the definition of privileged access? Where are the interrelated systems? What does the flow look like? And we talk about yes, sort of keys to the castle, high risk accounts, but you've got SaaS and you've got configuration of SaaS, and you have
Yeah.
not necessarily sort of big full domain administration, but much lower configuration management items and tasks. And you then bring in different stakeholders. So you could have, mentioned developers earlier on, but you could have more localized admins. You could have people who are
Right.
building software, shipping software. There's different stakeholders in that food chain as well. And I think it is the privileged components are not just in one place anymore, are they? They are
No, it's a broad
distributed.
church. It's a broad church of human accounts, non-human accounts, increasingly into agentic, as you mentioned on the slide, right? And all of them could expose different facets of privileged access that you need to think about how we protect it. So it's a very broad school of different communities that we need to worry about there, and nowhere near as narrow as it's been in the past, for sure.
No, and I guess one thing I want to just amplify before I move on, it is that security scaling bit as well. And we don't know what the future has in mind. Maybe we do a little bit with AI, but the sort of AI adoption aspect, it came a little bit out of the blue in the sense of
Right.
the innovation of that or the adoption of that is just, obviously it's been huge, the last whatever, 18, 24 months. And we don't quite know what the next 5, 8 years may look like. Now, clearly it's going to be AI centric or maybe NHI centric in some, but there's going to be other innovations that happen. And I think it's important to have that security scaling part of your sort of design strategy and not think, right, okay, I'm going to go in and rip and replace and build a PAM solution for now, for the systems I've got or the problems I have. But actually, what may happen over the next 6, 12, 18 months?
Agreed, and that's where the point about being policy centric, I think, is so
Mm,
important, because to me and my evolution of thought on privileged access went away from, we're not really talking about vaulting and locking away accounts. We're talking about controlling risk, and we need to have the tools and levers to put ourselves in a position to set guardrails around the environment, so we're flexible over, one, we can scale them, but two, we're flexible over time. So as that technical world inevitably changes wildly over the next 2 to 5 years, we're ready for that. We've got the right technology in place to be flexible and not have to hand curate an answer for a slightly different flavor of the same challenge we've seen in the past. We're actually in a point where we can say, hey, how do I set some rules around what can happen here, so that I can take control and I can define and limit harm and blast radius effectively, which for me is what privileged access management is all about.
It's jotted down there. It's sort of moving away from customization to configuration.
Exactly.
Again, I think historically PAM was you do some installation of stuff on-prem and get it up and running, and then each of the sort of onboarding of systems and accounts was a customized, complex thing, and it wasn't flexible in honesty. And each change was customized, whereas now it should be a config item, and by this, how you onboard a system, maybe there's a change in the service accounts for NHI or the usage of that stuff alters just due to the change in the business. And it should be just a BAU, business as usual activity.
Exactly. How I always talk of it this way. So I use this analogy a lot when I talk about it because it helps me. I'm big into sports. I like my sports. In sports, they say the success of the team is more about the worst performance of the worst player than the best performance of the
Right.
best player. Right? It's about the floor, not the ceiling, that defines your overall success. And I think identity security is really the same. Hand curating answers to each system for that system is not a scalable approach to build a robust floor and baseline of protection that we need to be successful. And that's a lot of what I think about in terms of establishing a baseline that we can measure, and how do we do that in a way that then allows us to flex and move with the business as they upgrade, migrate, change systems, bring new technologies in. We get
Yeah.
new identity types, so we're ready for them.
I think that I guess we could segue here and talk about England's World Cup chances and the flaws and stuff there, but maybe that's a separate podcast or webinar, I guess. But you're right in the sense of maybe the business is moving faster than it ever was, and competitive pressures. We have challenger startup entities in a whole host of different sectors. You may have a competitor who's using AI and suddenly becomes more competitive than you. So you have to move fast. You have to
Very
move and
fun.
make technical decisions. You're going to change your business process. You may suddenly say, right, well, we're going to leverage a new SaaS application because it's quick and it's cheap, and suddenly you then have to manage the accounts and the privileges within that SaaS system, which in itself, the admin of a SaaS app, that's a privileged function,
Mm,
and if that's
absolutely.
not done effectively, that's a problem. So yeah, you're right. The business is moving at the speed of sound, and it needs to have scalability, policy-centric ways of just sort of growing as the business grows. I think is often overlooked. And I guess now built a bit of a picture of Pam's a mess. It needs to change. The on-prem world has sort of caught up with us a little bit, and it sounds like AD is in the headlights of the bad guys. So what can we do here? And I want to sort of unpick a little bit around this sort of faultless approach.
Mm,
We talked a little bit already around the old days of very on-prem, vault-centric or system-centric ways of handling credentials or permissions or checking out accounts, and you have this big sort of safe, if like a digital safe in a central place. What is this alternative? Is there an alternative, and what does this vaultless sort of thing look like?
yeah, absolutely. So we think a little bit differently about the problem. As we say, privileged access is really about risk control and the needs of kind of coverage in terms of scale, and the diversity of identities is materially different to what we've seen before. So what we think about, rather than trying to take an account, have that difficult conversation with a system owner or an engineer, say, hey, I need to vault this human non-human account, and we need to do some work to enable that to happen. We really think about how we can harden the identity infrastructure itself and enable security policies to be applied. So in this example here we've got on screen, we've got users on the top left, or identities. So that could be human, non-human. They're trying to access resources, servers, databases that are attached to Active Directory in this case. So what we do is we work with Active Directory. We're a Microsoft partner, have been for a long time, to put a component in place that sends all of that authentication traffic and information to Silverfort, which then can execute policy. So those policies can fall into one of three buckets. So the first is it could protect administrators. We can apply MFA. And the beauty of doing it this way is it's done in real time. So it can't be evaded. So I open up my RDP session as normal, put my credentials in, it goes to Active Directory, and then I'll get a prompt on my desktop, maybe through Teams, saying, hey, I need to MFA because it's a high risk session. So I haven't changed anything as an admin about how I've worked, but I've added that protection layer into Active Directory behind the authentication. In the same way we can do it with just in time, we can level up to just in time. A lot of people were thinking about zero standing privilege as part of their privileged access strategy, and it's a really good way to do that. The second area on the right-hand side at the bottom is service accounts, machine identity, NHI, where because we're seeing all of this traffic about what's going on in Active Directory, we know who's going from where to where, what protocol, when, how many times, all of that telemetry. So then we can see what's common, what's really consistent, and then identify what your non-human accounts. Now, that might include human accounts being used as non-human. I know I found some of them when I implemented. But the important part then, over the top of that discovery and knowing about that attack surface, is then being able to put guardrails in. So, for example, if service count X always goes from A to B on a certain protocol, we can learn that behavior and then lock it down without changing anything about how the system works, without deploying agents on the system, because we're able to protect and build integrity of the identity system, Active Directory. The third box, zero trust, this is where we get into kind of risk control beyond protection. We say, hey, how can I segment that environment with that understanding and telemetry? Say, this warehouse only needs to talk to the stock system. Why would I let it do anything else? So we're seeing that kind of network thinking almost coming into identity to really help us control and constrain blast radius. So, if you're not confident that you've got a solid perimeter to your privileged environment, we can say, hey, human connections must come via the bastions. Deny them if that doesn't happen. And that just puts us in a position where we can set those rules, those guardrails, and enforce those risk reducing steps and measures by policy, right? So we can apply it to different users, groups of users, all users, different sources and destinations. So it's really, really flexible and powerful way of approaching the problem. And that's without vaulting. If you've got a vault, great, it works with it. But this is really the kind of, I see it as the bedrock of that, foundational security for Active Directory in this case, without having to do the difficult work of changing your business.
Yeah, I think it's some really interesting parts. I think one is, it sounds like you don't need to know everything up front, which I think, if you go back 15 years ago, you talk about sort of waterfall methodologies, you need to know everything before you build something. And that was a little bit like PAM. You would need to know your baseline behaviors. Who's going to check out what? When are they going to do it? Apply some controls. And that's okay for a very small environment. But I guess in this, you can think about things much more dynamically, and things will change. And this is about identifying the data aspects of which accounts involved, what are they accessing, why are they accessing it. But then, as you mentioned there, this sort of runtime angle as well. Build a baseline. In the baseline, I imagine will change over time as back to maybe the business will change, or the actors and the identities involved, their behaviors will change. And I think it is important to know that baseline, and then obviously looking for deviations to that as well. And I think that the segmentation thing, again, it's zero trust has been around for a long time. We talk about this, I guess, in a sort of throwaway manner, but things like segmentation are really important because it's a real key cornerstone of security by design, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't always come from the network in Active Directory on-prem environments. You don't always get that. Not all companies look that way. And I think it's really important, if we're going to treat identity as a new perimeter, it's a fundamental part of it, of us containing and constraining risk and how it can move around our organization to protect what really matters. So I think it's, when I speak to the best PAM teams, they're really not just thinking about protecting accounts. That's important.
Yeah.
It's the baseline thing. It's really then about understanding and segmenting that business risk to acceptable levels. And that's where, vaultless approach has a very high kind of ceiling and headroom for where you can take it, not just getting stuck in the cycle of onboarding accounts and protecting accounts that you're worried about, but looking beyond that and how we can kind of move into this zero trust style segmented environment.
Mm-hmm. The other thing which I jotted down here is change, in the sense of change is all around us, identity flux and the continuous nature of this sort of stuff. And the business changes, the business objectives, and the risk around the business changes. And I think you need to have this sort of more dynamic, reflexive approach to privilege. And it isn't just static and you build something and walk away. It needs to be monitored and understood in a more
Yeah, completely.
flexible way. And I think that to me, that change angle is important. And I guess to me, obviously we talk about AD a little bit here, but I want to sort of just amplify or maybe get your opinion really on the sort of future view here,
Mm.
in the sense of, if you look at the sort of standard time progress sort of deployment model, change is all around, and clearly organizations don't want to just rip and replace and have yet another single product, which is a very narrow fit. I think we've amplified this case around, there's a hybrid landscape. So we have on-prem, we have cloud, you have a cloud service provider, you have SaaS, you have AD, interacting and integrating the whole host of systems. And clearly, many organizations, they want to be able to scale what they do, but they don't necessarily want to scale the security function. They want to be able to have the tools that they've invested upon, I guess, sort of auto scale with them, I guess. This, to me, this more runtime dynamic approach, it seems to fulfill that. So we don't really know what's going to happen with NHI and AI, other than adoption is going to be huge. So I
Yeah,
guess, is this future proofing them as well?
100%, absolutely. So if you look at that kind of base philosophy of enforcement at runtime, of taking those different parts of the identity infrastructure, leveling up the ones that aren't particularly strong, like Active Directory, but providing integrity and effectiveness more broadly as a team, that's exactly the mindset we have at Silverfort. So, AD and protecting AD and this faultless PAM is where this company started. And it's a really difficult part of identity, right? Technically very hard. But as we move into, for example, agentic, right, we can take that same methodology and approach. We can apply it to things like Copilot Studio, Vertex,
Yeah,
Bedrock.
yeah.
We can apply it to MCP. And then we also have it sitting at the identity infrastructure layer. So, if you've got unsanctioned usage, we can still catch it at the bottom layer because we're taking that proactive, policy-based, enforcement centric view of identity security. And that's really what we're all about. We're investing more and more in that and bringing it to a broader and broader set of parts of the identity infrastructure. So
Mm.
it's incredibly important for us, and I think it's a real key cornerstone of being successful at scale in identity today and for what the future will bring, as you say.
I think the other thing I just jotted down there is, even if you look at AI and NHI and you adopt that fully for the next 18 months, if your foundation is not secure, it's a little bit like building on sand, isn't it? You need to have the basics done
That's
before
it.
you can start doing the advanced
I,
things like
I
agentic
worry a
AI.
lot about what agentic will expose in terms of some of those shaky foundations, not
Yeah,
just the risk of agentic itself, but
yeah, yeah.
what it's going to expose in what we've done in the past. And I think this type of approach to PAM, how do we limit risk, control risk, is really, really key cornerstone to feeling confident that we're adopting AI safely, not just in those agentic platforms, but in our identity layer as well. And that's really, really
So,
important.
yeah, that's a really good place to sort of end there. I think it is looking at, I guess it is looking end to end. We talked about systems and information flows. You need to consider this risk end to end. You need to identify where these high privilege, high risk systems are, not just the top one or two, and certainly in a more, I guess, porous, distributed zero trust world, it isn't just about the shiny stuff. It is about everything that sort of takes part of that flow of information, and AD is clearly a massive part of that. And now is the time to ask any questions. A question come through actually from an anonymous attendee, I should say. Hopefully it's a person and not an AI. But the question is, for the new world of PAM, is this a walk away from the old, or are there transitional plans or plays here? So I guess that's a good question, actually, isn't it? Are we being able to overlay what's there, or is this a rip and replace thing, or what's the sort of view
Yeah,
there?
absolutely. We see different. It depends what's driving you and where you're at with your PAM strategy today, and probably your vaulting program. So we see them fall into different camps. There are some companies who the implementation overhead of a vault is just too much, mainly
Mm.
operationally focused, low regulated companies with smaller identity teams. For those, we're often replacing vaults because they weren't able to generate the outcomes they wanted. For a lot of companies, though, vaults are doing valuable things at some scale, just not the scale
Yeah.
they want them to. And for those cases, it's really a case of augmenting what you've got, saying, hey, the Vault's doing what it's doing for your tier 0 admins, for example. Well, if you want to protect tier 1, use Silverfort for that to extend that protection and make sure what you've already done has integrity, that it's getting the outcomes you want. So we're seeing a real variety of things going on depending on where people are at and what they want from their PAM strategy. But it can live alongside very easily, but for some companies, it really is a different approach, which they see as more feasible, more viable to generate the outcomes that they're looking for in terms of protecting privilege.
Yeah, I think it's okay as well to have overlapping components in here, and I think that allows organisations to not only be protected, but again, it's that ability to move forward fast as well. So, augment what you have, improve what you have, because there's a lot of unknowns around business agility and where that risk may be, or where your sort of privilege risk may be. I think it's perfectly okay to keep foundations in place, be aware of the risk associated with them, and just to augment and build upon. And almost like it's like putting the lead around around some of the fractures in those foundations and protect them, and then build
Yeah,
on top of.
exactly. I think it's again that risk thinking, isn't it? Like, okay, an
Yeah,
account's in a
yeah.
vault, what's the remaining risk if I'm not session managing, or an account's not in a vault? What happens now? What's the risk? What's the biggest risk? So I think it's about that risk thinking, but from the perspective of scaling protection, generating that baseline, yeah, we're seeing a lot of companies choosing to go with Silverfort to replace vaults, but also a lot of them to
Mm.
augment and really get control of that risk that they're worried about.
Yeah, this is a good one. It's something we talk about a lot. As I guess as practitioners and consultants, I go in and do workshops and risk assessment and the likelihood and this, and everyone goes, let's just take a step back a little bit. I mean, what does that really mean? And it
Mm,
is looking for identifying things of value within the business and events of uncertainty happening to those things of value. And you mentioned the cheese thing earlier, and it's like, if you do a bit of a whiteboard and engage different stakeholders,
right.
what's working, what's not, what's important to a particular team or a particular business unit or a function, and what is the risk involved in that stuff not happening. And then you can filter out and say, how about, okay, that that system, they're really important. Okay, what can impact those systems going offline?
Mm,
Clearly, you've got admin and things, but it could be misconfiguration, it could be whatever, denial of service and things like this. And it's just mapping those individual systems, what can go wrong, and then, as you say, you then into, is it a vault, is it vaultless, is it runtime protection, and another.
exactly.
It definitely needs a bit of a more dynamic approach. We've rattled through 52 minutes there, Rob. It's gone fast, and we've certainly
It
hopefully
has.
covered a
It
lot
has.
of
Great
different
conversation.
material there. I guess wrapping up, a couple of calls to action, of course. Reach out to Cyberhut if you're looking for, understand this in a bit more detail from a sort of advisory point of view. But obviously, from Silverfort, you guys got a lot of material on your website, demos, and the whole sort of modern PAM approach there. But I guess, is there any final sort of comments from your side while we wrap things up?
Not at all. It's been a pleasure being with you. I think it's a really important subject, and I think we got into some really interesting and important stuff. So just appreciate you having me on.
Not at all. No, not at all. It's great to hear about vendor strategy, but I think also that it's those pragmatic steps as
Right.
well around, look, this is the problem space, educate, and then obviously this is where a solution can fit in it, and more importantly,
Exactly.
how organizations can start to think about this. So I think, PAM, like IGA, like authentication, they're continually innovating, but they need to as well, because I think the business benefits, external adversarial threats, they're only just increasing, and they're only becoming more sophisticated. And you mentioned sort of chaining attacks and stuff like this. It's vitally important to understand the risk, apply not just controls, but as you say, controls specific for the system in the business elements involved. I think all those are really vital, important points. And I think as well, it is a journey as well. You talk about time and progress. It is a um, sort of continual battle against sort of bad guys, unfortunately. And I think we have the capabilities. I think we have the knowledge now as well in the industry. I think, which is a big difference in maybe 15,
Yeah,
20 years.
yeah. You've got to go through those phases of learning about what works and what doesn't work so well to learn, what you need next. And that's something we try and do a lot as we talk to companies. So yeah, really exciting new option for companies when they're thinking about privileged access on-prem.
Good stuff. Excellent. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks for sharing your insights and wisdom and sort of vision there for Silverfort and how to tackle some of these problems. I think it's only a problem space which is going to get bigger, but I think it's quite reassuring to know we have the technology and some of the sort of concepts now to try and tackle some of these problems. So thank you. Take a bit of time out. Thank you to the audience for watching. This has been the industry webinar with the Cyber Hut. Thank you for watching. Thanks to Rob and the Silverfort team, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, everyone.